I was like just interested in what uh, you all think of using and mobilizing this framework of an Asian diaspora. If that's something that's useful for you, do you find any possibilities there or limits? And creatively, how do you approach this idea, right? As both a methodology, but also a theoretical framework for what.
Are you thinking about like the term diaspora and its specificity as opposed to others we might use? Or is it more like the Asian, like that kind of the umbrella-iness of the term? Is it, oh, both?
Yeah, I think both are contested terrains, right? And what is useful about bringing them together? Is it somewhere we want to go in our own thinking? Because, oh yeah, for me, honestly, I haven't. Um, I've thought in diasporic terms, but not thinking in Asian diaspora, which, I recognize can be useful.
I mean, I think it's certainly, I don't have an answer necessarily. I mean, I think it's a phrase, a set of concepts. It's certainly an intellectual tradition. I think both in the sort of thinking about like the concept of and the intellectual work of diaspora and diaspora studies. There's a sort of an intellectual, a body of work there that has certainly been useful and important to me. It's a term that I use um, or in my teaching, I taught and in my writing sometimes, right? It's a term that I use descriptively as in a kind of a shorthand way, right? So it has, I think, a kind of usefulness, um, like many umbrella, those kinds of, I think, umbrella or I don't, whether we want to call them kind of comparative or relational terms, right, of gathering together different kinds of people and communities, and but also experiences, right? Um, so it does some work to name or allow us to talk about some things that are shared or the experience of being called to relate with others through what is shared. Um, I mean, but at the same time, there are of course problems, and that emerges right as we discuss it, right? The limits of Asian as this complex term, right? It operates. I mean, I think like a lot of identifying and kind of racial and racialized terms, right? It operates in the world, and so it is something that I think interpolates, that we are interpolated by, and at least in the diaspora, or in this context, and that. So I do think in that sense it's something we have to reckon with in some way, that to sort of engage with. So there's those kinds of, I think, problems. There's problems too. I think diaspora is a term whose usefulness comes with the way that it links, right, these ideas both of dispersion and settlement, right, etymologically, but in ways that don't. I mean, there's such a range of kinds of ways of being in away, right, from a space, and some of the temporal ways that I think V is talking about too, right, that we're not always settled. The idea of settlement itself is, of course, a problem, right, for its the way that it implicates us in settler colonial projects, right? So we end up often having to, we use this term Asian diaspora, and then we end up in the classroom, for example, disaggregating, right, talking about specificity, and it's on how it doesn't fit. So I'm just kind of naming some of what is like both what feels inevitable in some ways about such terms, that they have a kind of usefulness, but also they're inevitable problems. I'll also say, I mean, diaspora is, I think, a term that actually doesn't circulate really very much outside of, I find, academic or certain kinds of para-academic settings. So often I'll ask my students if it's a term they know, and they usually don't, right? So it's so that I struggle with too. It's why I'm teaching a course on diasporic kind of cultural production this fall, but I didn't use the term in the title because it seems to me that it's not actually that transparent for most people. So that's another kind of issue that I think about, but I don't know. But I'm curious to hear what others think.
Yeah. I find what you really put your finger on around like for instance, the Asian diaspora, I find the Asian both productive and problematic, and maybe it's is the duality of it that is interesting, because often find the Asian is often invoked either in kind of politicized way, that it, invoking solidarity, or naming racism or anti-racist activism, but then in everyday life it really doesn't often, in the kind of really everyday way, people don't think, like in, say, a city like Vancouver, very few people actually think of themselves as being in the Asian diaspora. And then the kind of national and ethnic identification often then gets invoked instead. And sometimes I find that contradiction really productive and interesting. I often wish we could dwell in it more. One example I've had, which for me was really interesting, was a few years ago. One of the Burnaby MLA wants to bring the Comfort Women statue to Burnaby. And so we helped them with a community consultation, thinking that's really interesting. Like, let's see what the communities have to say. And the Japanese Canadian community just refused to come. They just were like, this is a bad idea. This will recreate racism against Japanese Canadians. But of course, at the same time, the Korean, Canadians were really behind the project. And then the national kind of come in, because then there's like forces in Japan and in South Korea that try to also interfere and meddle with it. And so for us, it's really failed as a community event. But for me, intellectually and politically, it became really interesting. In that case, there is no such thing as an Asian diaspora, right? Where the tension, the geopolitical history, the incommensurability of communities like really come into play. And for me, that failure is sort of productive. I almost wish we could have dwelt in it more, rather than kind of just say, oh, we failed to bring communities together. But I feel like that space, maybe that diasporic space, actually could produce some interesting conversations. So yeah, that was sort of one experience of failure, but nonetheless maybe a productive failure.
I never thought of diaspora as being important to my research, and it was a blind spot, because after this book came out, a lot of people asked me this question as to why is it that my site seems so hermetically sealed, and one is it, and I knew this is a pertinent question because when I was very, very young, one of the earliest queer activists in South Asia, Pavan Dal, who organized the first Pride Parade in South Asia in 1999, I remember him telling me this very moving story about somebody from the Indian diaspora in Canada. This is like 20 years ago. I didn't know I would end up in Canada or become an academic. So the story was very moving because of other reasons. And Pavan told me that somebody in the Indian diaspora in Canada actually smuggled pornography, gay pornography, to Calcutta. And this was he told me this 20 years ago, and he was recounting this that had happened 20 years ago. So it was like 30 to 40 years ago. And I remember him telling me that there were so many people in that activist group who had seen pornography for the first time, and what it did for them was this was the first time they were actually seeing men express their sexuality in a tender way for each other. Like, because male sexuality, when directed towards another male body, was only available in language in such violent ways that, that of sodomy and legal discourse of rape and things, that even though they had desire, queer desire, they actually had never seen queer desire expressed in a tender way, where, it doesn't necessarily need to track the path of rape and violence. That story stuck to me. Sorry. So that story stuck to me because I was really curious as to who this dude was that was smuggling gay porn from Canada. Right. And so it was always there, but I never studied diaspora. But now these stories and these memories keep on coming back to me because so much we don't know. It hadn't been recorded about how the diaspora actually came back to the nation, how queer diaspora came back to the nation, not just nation in the diaspora, but diaspora in the nation. So that is why diaspora has suddenly become very important to me because of the massive history of Indian students studying in Canada, working in Canada, and going back. And I assume, and just one more story, and then I'll finish. I know I'm a bit rambly, but this is a new topic. When I did move to Vancouver 2 years ago, I got into a taxi, and it was an old Punjabi taxi driver, and he struck up conversation, and he told me, unprovoked. I don't know what provoked him to tell me the story. Not that hard to guess. But he told me when he came to Canada in the 70s, he went to a bar and the first woman he danced with was a trans woman. And that memory is still with him after so long. And then, he was like, oh, I had a lot of fun. She was so beautiful. It really changed how I looked at trans women, hijras. And so those are the very kind of minute capillaries that I'm very interested in, like fleeting encounters that last for 40 years and how diaspora plays a role in it. Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, and like back, sort of Nadine's point about in some way, diaspora studies privileges a kind of settledness, and there are sometimes I do like other paradigms like around mobility, or migration, which kind of do more multi-directional, like don't assume there's a kind of settledness in the diaspora, but yeah, like so for me, I don't know, maybe you also can tell us a bit about whether you find the framework useful, and whether what we've said resonate with your own research framework.
Well, yeah, I find them useful precisely for some of the stories that V was just sharing and what we were talking about earlier about the ordinariness of how people narrate or remember their lives. It's very much in a diasporic way, even though people might not, like Nadine was saying, call it diaspora, but these entanglements across different geographies and time periods that help make sense of who and where and what we are. I think it's useful to think about them through this framework or lens of diaspora. Because it necessarily evokes these connections that takes us beyond like just thinking about one-way movement, as you were saying, Helen. And because when I can't help but think I've been thrust into this world of thinking about environment and health, and through resource extractive programs, and a lot of people narrate from here. Climate crisis just in this place, right? But if you talk to Filipinos, they don't narrate climate crisis using this idea of climate crisis, but they think of their hometowns and recent, disasters, floods, unexpected and unanticipated surges from the sea, landslides, and from their hometowns, and they're not necessarily thinking about it here, the here-ness of it, but although they're living out their lives here. So I think it's, like because of those everyday stories that I think resonate in different communities that V was describing, like how we make sense of ourselves and how we make sense of each other, that encounter in the in the taxi cab. yeah, and my encounters at the bus, waiting for a bus, about who we are, asking what part of the Philippines, what's my last name, and relating stories that we might have from where we're from or from where my parents are from. I think are very diasporic. But as Nadine said, it's not necessarily um, the terms we use to make sense of our everyday lives. In terms of the category that you're all speaking of, Asianness, I don't know if it's me or maybe I'm just getting older, but I sense there's been a qualitative shift in Filipinos used to not evoke this idea of Asianness in the diaspora, but only very recently, and I would say in the last little while. It could be because of COVID and increased racism and the random targeting of what people see as Asian, which has included Filipinos, that we've now coalesced around this idea of as a political category of Asianness.